Welcome to the second session, the Admissions Director panel. And again, to the global audience that is following this on live stream, we're here in the New York Times Center, which often plays host to Meryl Streep, Helen Mirren, Sting, real sort of media all-stars. When it comes to the world of MBA admissions, I think we've matched that with an all-star panel, starting with Michael Robinson. It's lovely to see you again after many years, Michael, and to see how your career has blossomed at the Columbia Business School, now Director of MBA admissions there. And my regret, Morgan, is that we didn't meet sooner. So Morgan Bernstein is the Executive Director for full-time MBA admissions from UC Berkeley Haas. She has some of the best admissions advice. Drink a glass of wine before you think about writing any of the essays to apply to business school. We did say we would be serving wine from 4 o'clock this afternoon. Colin Davis, who's the Director of Admissions at Chicago Booth. I'm sure you're going to be kept very busy this afternoon, Colin. And Heather Holland, who's a Senior Associate Director of Admissions at Emory's Goizeta. And I think I pronounced that right.
Yeah.
Good.
Hooked on phonics.
Michael, we're on home turf for you at Columbia. So talk us through an up and down year. I mean, the schools have had some record application volume in the last 4 or 5 years. International audience perhaps down for many of the schools this year. What have you been seeing at Columbia?
Well, we saw a slight increase in domestic applications and a drop in international applications. When we're on the road, we're definitely seeing more anxiety on the part of applicants as to how welcoming the U.S. is, more anxiety as to can I stay in the U.S. Post-MBA? Will it be more difficult for me to obtain a visa and so on? And the political rhetoric has not been helpful. And I'll just leave it there.
And I mean, this is not a political platform, but I mean, you talk about that sort of rhetoric or even how the media portrays these stories. The reality is that I'm sitting next to representatives of 4 of the top business schools in the United States that can open up career opportunities like no other. So between that rhetoric and the actual reality, what are Columbia MBA students seeing, as they're coming out of school at the moment? They still have tremendous opportunities open to them.
Well, the anxiety is in the classroom as well. So we, as a school, have put in more resources in terms of free legal help, giving more people more resources to help navigate a process that has become slightly more challenging. The rules haven't changed, but the application of those rules have changed. So if you made a small mistake in years past in filling out an application, that was ignored in the past, now it can be disqualifying. So just making sure that, that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed, and so on. And again, the anxiety of the people in the classroom is real, but if you look at the outcomes, our students are still getting great jobs post-graduation and so on. But as an administrator, you still have to deal with that reality as well.
Right. Morgan, with over 4,000 applications, I mean, Haas is more selective than the Harvard Business School. So we're delighted that you've been growing the intake. You're up to what now, 285, heading to 300.
Yep.
So it's getting a whole lot easier to get into Haas, right? What are you seeing both in the US market and internationally?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, like many of the other top business schools, we were also down a little bit last year in terms of applications. But I think, there's still, clearly the value of an MBA in the marketplace is still very strong. I think as, Michael was saying, it's just a lot about preparation, about education. I think in particular for some of our international students who may feel that they're going to be challenged in the process, we make sure to start with them a little bit earlier on, set expectations, et cetera. And the same thing goes for admitted students, right? Making sure that we are, connecting them with the resources that can help them through the visa application process and making sure that they're able to start that process very early on.
Right. Your colleague Pete Johnson often talks about, that there's froth. It's sometimes counter-cyclical of, candidates that step in or step out of, applying to business school. But essentially, you've still got that core of really quality applicants that are coming through year after year after year.
Yeah, no, of course, and actually just in the back we were talking about how even in these challenging times where you may have a down year, that standardized test scores at most top schools are still on the rise. And I think it's true. I think it's just that, you know, the quality of candidates who are looking to become our future business leaders is growing. You know, and I think because you see that coming through in some of the statistics for all of the programs, right? I think there's not a lot of concern about the quality of students that are coming through or the quality of leaders that we're going to be able to put forth.
Right. Now, we sit on a stage and, you know, 10 years ago, Lehman Brothers, people were walking out with boxes. Booth is one of the schools that perhaps is unfairly pigeoned as a finance school because, I mean, you have bench strength in everything, right? Have you seen a change, Colin, in either profiles or even sort of the post-MBA career goals that you're seeing from applicants?
You know, we have. I think there's been a broad diversification of student interest, especially kind of post that peer that you talk about. So I think, you know, as a school and a lot of institutions try to be responsive to a lot of those student interests. So, you know, we've actually had entrepreneurship that's extremely taken off, and the university and the school has really invested heavily in the resources, the support around that space, not only for students, but also for alumni as well. So, you know, I think there definitely is a diversification of interest coming in. You know, but it's really understanding, and to the earlier point, the value of the MBA and the broad application in terms of how you be able to kind of have that experience pay dividends over and over again throughout your career and across a broad spectrum of industries.
Right. It's the entrepreneurs, not the politicians, that are going to save the world, so keep that track going. Goizeta has also experimented beyond that full-time 2-year MBA experience. You have a 1-year MBA program and also areas like business analytics. You've launched a master's in that field. So is that for a very distinct and different audience that's looking at biz analytics for their next career steps?
It is. So the 1-year program, the profile of the student is similar in terms of age. A lot of people assume the 1-year program is for people with more years of experience, but the 1-year program is designed for career accelerators. The 2-year program is the flagship traditional. You can be a career switcher or a career accelerator, but the 1-year program is really for people who aren't looking to make a major shift. So you can't go from Wall Street to brand management and CPG. So there's no internship, so that we're really looking for students who are able to get the job they want without that summer internship. The MSBA, the analytics program, we see a younger student. Many of them are right out of undergrad, a lot of programming experience, much more technical, and so it's much more niche than the other 2 programs.
Right, and I'll come back to you because we'd love to sort of pull back the curtain on the mystery of admissions and what goes on, whether it's those September round 1 deadlines or, of course, starting with you, Michael, the only one of the top schools with a rolling admissions. So talk us through, perhaps specifically to Columbia with rolling admissions and even early application, a day in the life or what that cycle looks like.
Well, first, let me define rolling admissions. So all that means is that we read and review and make decisions on applications in order that we get them. So all things being equal, the earlier you apply, the better your chances. And we do have a binding early decision process. So if you think that Columbia is your first choice and so on, there's a spot for that person to apply as well. And it kind of syncs with what people may call round 1 in terms of our timeline. So it's a first week of October timeline. But the process is similar to my colleagues here. So there is at least one review of an application. And by review, I mean like someone reading the application, making notes, making a recommendation, and so on. Depending on who does that first read, if it's a junior staff member, then it goes to someone who's more senior, and then it goes to a committee and so on, who then decides, do we interview that person or not? We interview probably about 35 to 40% of the people who apply to our program, and I would say we admit roughly half of those that we interview.
Right. And just on interviews, because that's over a third of the applicants either here in New York or with the team that's on the road, or even alumni that are involved.
Yeah, so the interviews are done mostly by alums in the city where the applicant is based. But of course, we sometimes see applicants in places where we don't have any alums. So for example, there's a growing number of people who are military veterans who are actually in the field fighting war right now and so on, and we don't have any alums in caves in Afghanistan. So we would do something via Skype or something like that to do that interview. I met with a guy in Israel and so on. I mean, he's going to spend the next 4 weeks in a submarine, so he's like just not available and so on. So depending on the needs of the applicant, we'll adjust. But I would say over 90% of our interviews are done by alumni in the city, and then the rest are like extenuating circumstances.
Right. Morgan, it's only fair if applicants are drinking wine before they tackle that 6-word Hemingway-style essay that, of course, your admissions team is drinking wine through this entire application process. Perhaps in talking us through a typical round, also round 1 versus round 2. I mean, you're looking to craft that diversity across the entire admissions cycle. And therefore, how you sort of look at round 1 applicants, but keep bearing in mind other great candidates that you're going to see later in the cycle.
Yeah, no, that's a great question because, obviously we don't know what's coming up in round 2 when we're evaluating round 1. I mean, I think so just in terms of looking behind the curtains, I think our process is very similar to what Michael just outlined. One thing that I would just sort of close the loop there on is to acknowledge that all of our decisions are made by the entire committee. So it may not be the most time efficient, but we do find that it's a great way for all of the committee members to weigh in on someone, because then you get inputs, on somebody who has read your application, on somebody who may have met you at a recruiting event, or who may have talked to you on the phone, et cetera. So it is truly a holistic both review and then ultimately the decision-making process.
Right.
I mean, I think in terms of round 1 versus round 2, the process that we're going through in terms of how we evaluate candidates, the interviews, et cetera, is exactly the same. When you come into round 1, I think ultimately we're calibrating against what good looked like in the prior year, right? Because that's really our benchmark. And having been on the admissions team for 7 years now, I can say that we will always make an offer of admission to a strong candidate in round 1. Right? I've never had a time where we had to say, oh, this person looks amazing, but we better hold off until round 2. We want to make offers of admission to candidates in any round when they apply, when they're looking good, which is why you'll hear admissions directors always saying, apply as early as possible when you can submit your strongest application, because a strong application will always rise to the top, no matter when it's submitted. So, inevitably there will be candidates who are waitlisted in round 1, and at Berkeley Haas we'll then re-review them alongside our round 2 candidates. So then they'll get a decision or perhaps just an update from us alongside round 2, once we do have a chance to kind of see what good looks like for that particular year.
Right. So, Colin, you're a director of admissions, not a director of rejections. and as those thousands of applications come in round 1, round 2, even in round 3, your team, you're looking for reasons to admit people into the Booth program, right?
Correct. Well, I think first and foremost, we're looking for reasons to interview, to get to understand and to try to identify, is there a connection here? Is there something that we want to dig a little bit deeper and understand about that individual? So, the positioning yourself to actually really approach the interview is highly important. I think largely the process is very similar at Booth, but I'll point out a couple of distinctions. One, we do not operate under a rolling basis. So for us, the review time actually starts basically the day after the deadline. So for us, for round 1, that's actually next Thursday. But, so if you submit your application early, it's not as though you have any advantage or you will get a decision any earlier than anyone else. So that's kind of the starting block for our process. The other nuance that I'll kind of identify is that, when it comes to the interviews, it's really important for us, for the applicant to really get connected and engage with the different people that make up our community, so our students, our alumni. So if an individual wants to come to campus to interview, all of those interviews are actually conducted by current students. And likewise, if you're in a region where you cannot necessarily might not be able to come to campus, we identify and connect you with an alum. And the big purpose of the interviews really is, we want it to be a good experience. It's not kind of like your traditional job interview. We actually want it to feel much more like a conversation. We want you to walk away feeling like that was really great experience. And then after that process, what will happen is whether it's an alum or a student, they'll actually kind of craft a post-interview report. And it'll really cover a number of dynamics that happen during the interview, from your interpersonal skills, to things like, how did you handle resiliency throughout your career goals, and then, do you really have an understanding for the resources available to Booth, and have you really thought deeply about your fit there? So at that point, similarly, we have a committee review where we sit together and really try to kind of calibrate to identify, all right, is this an individual that we want to admit, waitlist, or ultimately deny?
Right, so enjoy the FaceTime with Colin this afternoon, because from next Friday onwards, the guy's barely going to get out of his pajamas. He's going to be reading constantly for 8 weeks. Thank you for dressing up for today's event. Heather, with applicants typically looking at many business schools, and you'd actually encourage them to consider all these great options at the world's top business schools. As you're reading that application, can you really tell when it's speaking to Goizueta and the school, its tremendous strength out of Atlanta?
Yeah, we can, and I think that's my biggest piece of advice, is just make sure you're very authentic in your application. So we're looking for consistency, that your essays, the spirit of your essays and the sound of your essays sound like how your recs describe you, sound like how you talk to us in an interview. And we can tell when you've jerry-rigged it, and we know that you're applying to a ton of schools, and we all have different essays, and we can tell when it doesn't sound like us. And so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for you to demonstrate that you can be successful in the classroom. MBAs at every school, it's going to be tough. No matter who you are, what your GMAT is, it's going to be tough. So we want to make sure you can handle the classroom, that you can get the job you want, and that you're going to be a fit in the community. We are the smallest school, I think, on this stage, and so there's no hiding. And so we just want to make sure that you are the type of team member that is going to gel well at our school. And so that's what we look for in that application process. So it's not transactional. It's not just take the GMAT plus the GPA minus the interview score, come up with a formula. There's a lot more subjective approaches to deciding.
Right, and it's great to have the four of you.
Can I build on that last response?
Please, Michael.
Because I think that advice there is very important. And I'd say in the 16 years that I've been doing admissions, probably about 15 to 20% of the folks who apply submit what I call very generic applications. And the advice I want to leave you with is, do a name change test when you are reviewing your essays. By that I mean, if your essays can work, if you change the name from Columbia to Haas to Chicago to Emory and so on, and it works perfectly, that means it doesn't work at all, right? So that's one little thing you can do to basically say, am I submitting something that is very generic, applies to every school? Because if it applies to every school, it applies to no school.
Right. And of course, with Columbia, we're watching a video about New York, which, from a marketing perspective, who's not going to use that in their collateral? But that matters to you, because you really want to see all four schools, that connection with academic rigor, corporate social responsibility, whatever those sort of core strengths of the school. Michael, to talk to one of Morgan's points about maybe timing, just to go back to the rolling admissions process, better chances applying too early. But let's not mistake that the true goal is to put together a thoughtful and application that identifies with the culture of Columbia and connects with you and the team. And that moves well beyond that early decision deadline of October 4th.
Yes. So we get the bulk of our applications post our binding early decision process. And I think many schools tend to see the bulk of their applications within, I would say, an October to late January timeframe. So apply when you're ready, right? But I think it's important to be thoughtful. I like to say that before you start writing, I think it's important to be thoughtful, reflective, look inward first, get a real sense of who you are, what drives you, what kind of academic environment is the right one for you, what do you want to accomplish from an MBA program, and then start looking outward at schools, and then in essence, you're trying to match the best version of you as a leader with that institution. And we like people who are very intentional as to what they want to get from our program, but the folks that we love will contribute more than they take.
Right. We could connect by Skype or Zoom, but Morgan, on a phone call, you can hear when somebody's smiling. You can hear it in a voice. Can you see when someone, as Michael was saying, has enjoyed stepping back, to really think about why business school, why Haas or any of these other great schools? Is that something that comes through?
Enjoyment. Well, I'm not sure that anybody at the time they hit submit is going to say that they actually enjoyed writing their essays or studying for those standardized tests. I think you can definitely sense some relief. But I think in terms of getting a sense of the character, of the candidate, I think a lot of that also comes through in the questions that schools choose to ask. And so at Berkeley Haw, as you alluded to earlier, our 6-word story essay. And I think that is one because it allows people to really think outside the box, for lack of a better term, and to be creative, to potentially be vulnerable, to tell a personal story. That, I think, is where we really tend to see emotion, character, possibly enjoyment. I think one of to Michael's point earlier, just about a lot of anxiety around the application, one of the things that I think candidates tend to really overthink is how they communicate that emotion, that personal story in the application. And one of the pieces of advice that I've been giving this year is really just to try and simplify your story. Right? I think candidates tend to feel like, oh, I have these 10 to 15 points I need to get across, and I have to talk about these 5 skills and these 5 experiences and these 5 students and alums who I know, and they try and scatter all of that throughout their application. Well, when, as admissions officers, we're reading hundreds, if not thousands of essays and applications every year, we're not going to remember 10 things about you. And if we're trying to remember 10 things about every single candidate, we're going to forget them all. So my advice would be to simplify that story that you're trying to tell and really hone in on what are those top 3 things you want us to know about your character or your experience. And as Heather was saying, make sure that those same things are woven throughout so that you're telling a consistent story. Right. Because that, I think, is when the enjoyment or the vulnerability or the passion, whatever it may be, is going to come through.
Right. 6 words is not enough. No, that's only 5 words. I'm going to have to spend some more time thinking about that one. All of you publish a class profile for an incoming class, and of course the rankings reinforce this very reductive process. If you met someone this afternoon, Colin, who said, hey, I have the same 730 that is the average at the class, I have the 3.6 GPA that is the average for the school, and guess what, by the time I join school next year, I'm going to be 28 years old too, so Colin, I'm perfect for Chicago Booth. But those data points are very reductive. I mean, can you be too young? Can you be too old? Talk a little bit about the sort of the diversity that lies behind those figures.
Right. So obviously those are some of the averages coming in, but there's an entire range behind that. So yes, the GMAT is an average of 731, but the range of students that we have are from a 610 all the way to a 790. Right. So, and it's because it doesn't necessarily, to Heather's point, it's not just a science, right? We don't admit test scores, GMAT scores, we admit people. And there's much more to people than just some of these data points. So in thinking about some of these pieces, it really is important to understand the entire individual. What are the reasons for wanting an MBA? It really does fundamentally come down to a lot of those core whys. I think a lot of schools try to be as transparent as possible to say and orient their application in a way to say, these are the different values that are reflective of our institution. This is exactly the type of elements that we're looking for not only people to come and, to Michael's point, really absorb from the experience, but these are some of the people that are most productive in terms of contributing to the experience as well. So for a lot of pieces, there's so many important elements. It's from the recommendations to the way that you position yourself within the application to the way you really shape a compelling and coherent narrative that really speaks to a lot of why is now the right time for me to pursue an MBA, both personally and professionally. Why is now the optimal time for me to pursue this 2-year experience? And why do I feel like this school provides the best resources, the best community, the best culture for me to actually achieve my goals? And then at the end of the day, again, putting that together in a very succinct story that's compelling, that's genuine, that's authentic, but really convincing the school in terms of why that uniqueness that you offer fits with their school, but also brings a lot of value to that community as well.
Right. To sort of continue with that theme of diversity, Heather, we wrote a piece on poets about over 30s applying to business school that has been read by 115,000 people in the last 2 years. So there's an audience out there certainly asking themselves the question, even as you look then at the 1-year experience or the 2-year experience, from the 24-year-old that might really benefit from that summer internship in the 2 years versus someone age 31 for whom 1 year is the perfect ROI, they know where they want to go next. So how does age, it's not age per se, it's what you've done in that time, right?
Right. student. And so my advice is, or how we view it is, we are supplying companies with talent. And so students will come up and say, you know, I'm 32, am I too old? Well, of course not, but you want to understand the industry you're getting into, who's recruiting at Emory, what is their range. So it's hard, you know, we have a minimum of 2 years of work experience because we do believe work experience adds value to the classroom environment. And sometimes if students have too much experience, their expectations are too high for the types of jobs that are used to coming on Emory's campus. But you know, our average age is 28, so we do see quite a few students that are beyond that. And so I think, you know, just, it's not a number, but it's about what your expectations are and if we're going to be able to help you get there.
Right, and perhaps a question for any of the panel. If I was 32 and then talking to you about getting a job at McKinsey, Bain or BCG, I mean, their sweet spot for recruitment is probably younger than that. Do you actually work with your colleagues in career services to sort of reality check
We do.
The sort of post-MBA career goals that people are describing?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I'll kind of take that. So for Booth, absolutely, we are very closely aligned with some of the outcomes and some of the, you know, really the nuances and the trends with a lot of the companies that hire at Booth. I mean, you know, fortunately, we're in a fortunate position where we kind of have a broad spectrum of program formats that can really speak to someone who's earlier in their career or an individual who might want to continue to pursue an MBA while they're also working. So we have an evening and weekend program. And then for those individuals that might be a little bit more, you know, further on in their career, we have executive MBA programs as well. So we work very closely with our different programs and career services to really understand, you know, what's the type of experience, where is this individual in their phase of life, what are their goals, and then really to provide them with a format and an experience that most fits their goals and the phase of life where they're in.
Right. Michael, 16 years reading applications at Columbia, average, over 6,000 applications every year. I'm not saying that you read all of those, but you'd be in a 100,000-mile club if there was a diamond status for that one. And among them, you've seen many consultants, you've seen many bankers, you've seen perhaps more and more software engineers. Those are well-represented pools. It even feels today that, well, I'm non-traditional has become a well-represented pool because there are so many non-traditionals. How can those applicants, you know, from the big four, from the investment banks, from the big software firms, how can they stand out?
I sigh in answering the question because sometimes when we provide advice to people, people hear different things.
Right, and read between every line, right?
And in essence, there's a belief that each school has this detailed algorithm. So if I have this, put it in, and it's automatic. And that's not true, right?
If it was that easy, we'd be out of jobs.
Right.
Exactly. And trust me, there are people who believe that we should build something like that and just like get rid of admissions officers and so on, and hopefully that doesn't happen. But the thing is, I like to give this advice in terms of standing out. Going back to something that you said before about being your best authentic self, right? Sometimes I think people forget that, right? And they connect with people from a number of schools. They look at the person who's got admitted and so on. So, well, this person got admitted, so that means whatever that this person wrote must be the way to apply to this school. And very often people get admitted despite what they wrote, right? Because it is a holistic process. It's not an essay writing contest. So for me, I just want people to answer my 4 basic questions. Demonstrate to me that you can handle the work at a rigorous program. And more important, why will you accomplish your goals at a very high level? Are you interesting, multidimensional, and well-rounded, and so on? And do you have a real understanding of who we are as a school and how we are a good fit for you to achieve your goals? To me, do those things as opposed to, okay, well, how do I stand out because I see lots of bankers from Goldman Sachs or lots of consultants from McKinsey? Just share with us the best version of you. Now, the thing I would say, though, because we are in this city, which is very dynamic, so I think it's helpful and important to demonstrate your enthusiasm for that institution. So connect with the people who are really important, the current students who you'll sit with in the classroom, the alumni community, and so on. So if you were going to do an independent research project with a professor, who would it be and why, right? So that's a way for someone to distinguish themselves, where they have invested real time in learning who we are, learning who they are, and why the two work together, and real enthusiasm and passion for that institution. Because sometimes I think, I'll stop after this. Sometimes people forget to be humble. So I have all these stats and so on, so I'm automatic, so I have a 760. So I had a 3.7, I work for this great company. I think we probably turned down about 600 or 700 people that had 760s or more. So that by itself is not enough, right? It's just not enough.
I have
Please,
something to add.
Joy.
People ask, how can I stand out? And I sometimes say, it's okay to not stand out. Please don't force yourself to stand out. I don't know if you all are seeing this trend of this oversharing. We don't need to know all the details just so that we remember you. So just be cautious in what you share. I mean, I know we want to see some vulnerability, we want to see humility, but it's okay if you have a strong GMAT, you have good work, you have good academics. When we meet you and we interview you, that's typically when we can seal the deal. So I just caution people to just don't try so hard to stand out and throw us for a loop, because I read stuff that I can't ever unsee.
Right.
Right, and just I'm saying, okay, keep it to yourself.
Don't overshare. The mind boggles with social media. Michael talks about sort of 4 fundamental questions that you're asking. Haas thinks in terms of 4 pillars, both in terms of how to weave that in, but again, I'm sure some candidates overdo it in trying to show how they're forever a student and how they're challenging the status quo. So just be natural and let those stories unfold, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, at Berkeley Haas, one of the primary things that we're looking for is culture fit with our 4 defining principles, as you mentioned. But it's a very subtle kind of weaving that into your application. At no point in our process do we ask you, please tell me how you embody confidence without attitude, or give me an example of questioning status quo, and that's intentional. Right? We want to see those things come through in the examples that you choose to share with us, the way in which you tell those stories, the humility that comes into play there, and it also comes through not just in what the candidates themselves are writing, but also in what the recommender shares with us. That is one place where we do ask for more information about how you align with confidence without attitude. So the recommender will provide us with some insight there into your humility. And then, of course, in the interview as well. And so we, like Columbia, have our alumni do a lot of our interviews, but also our students as well. It is a rare occasion for a staff member to do an interview because we want our community, our student and alumni community, to help us evaluate culture fit. And so that interview will be very conversational. And among other things, they're looking to see, is this somebody who I would want to have on my study team? Is this somebody who I would want to go on a trek to Brazil with, right? Is this somebody who I would want to employ? Things of that nature. So.
Right. Humility is one of those wonderful intangibles. Michael, just back to you, because you raised that idea. Heather says you're eager to impress the admissions committee. So is there a sort of a reality check, perhaps having a friend that you trust, some third party to read through at the end with that, hey, Michael, you might be overdoing it and trying to tell Columbia too much.
Okay. So I need an extra 15 seconds to give some context. My parents got married in college, so I spent the first year of my life with my grandmother, right? My grandmother is very important to me, right? So everyone in this room has someone an adult who was very instrumental in their development. Sometimes it's not a parent, right? If that person read your essays, would they recognize you? And more important, would they like you, right? So I know there's lots of consultants in this space and they try to transform you, but again, think about that caring adult who drove your success. Would they still recognize you? And then all of us have at least one super sensitive friend that just gets really upset when something happens and so on. Have that person look at your application just to check for tone, because they'll pick up on all the little things where you're, what's the word you use, the phrase, like confidence with an average, confidence with it,
yeah.
Like they'll pick up, quote unquote, the attitude piece, you know? So we all have that person in our lives. I mean, we all have a kitchen cabinet, so basically just reach out to those people to get some extra input.
Right. And if Columbia's admissions team gets lots of letters of recommendation from grandmothers, Colin, your deadline is round one deadline 5 days away, probably 5 p.m. Central.
It's midnight, but
it's
midnight.
Oh, well, that's
There we go.
plenty
Fit in
of
that
time.
glass of wine.
And applicants that look at the hours they put in at the consulting firm or the bank, and they're like, I've never volunteered for something. And so they rush to start walking puppies at the animal shelter or something.
We see that, yes. Oh, sorry, we see that, yes.
So as you look at standing out in the pool, extracurriculars, community engagement, but something substantive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that's important, right? I think Michael's point is earlier that I think there's two things that go on. One, you try to kind of craft an application that checks all of these boxes, right? And the application is not a box checking competition. The other thing I feel like is though individuals almost really try to scrub part of themselves out of the application by saying, I can't address any challenge, anything that might not necessarily come across as a huge success. I need to take some of those out. And the reality is, when you go in an MBA, and even afterwards throughout your career, everything is not going to go exactly according to plan. So I think we want to understand, how do you deal with resiliency? I mean, what are different challenges and what have you taken away from those experiences? I mean, those are all things that are going to be important and detrimental to your success, not only in an MBA program, but as you go into leadership positions throughout your career. So I do see a lot of people that really try to kind of, like I said, almost scrub any of those experiences out. And I think there's value in positioning those in a way that's genuine, authentic, and fits within the larger narrative of where you want to go, why you're interested in the school as well.
Right. We had someone at a CentreCourt event a couple of weeks ago apologizing to the schools because she had, at some point in her career, danced for the Bolshoi, which actually seemed pretty impressive, but she had assumed, business schools wouldn't be interested in those interests outside of, professional endeavor and work. But that's actually something that would have jumped out to you at Goizeta and probably for the rest of the schools, right? How can we use those areas of passion and what can we demonstrate?
And sometimes you're really lucky to, if you are a Minnesota Vikings fan and I read your application, guess what? That's your application. That part of that, I'm joking.
Or if you're a Packers fan, that's okay too.
Then
that's okay
if you
too.
say that is a hard pass for Emory. But the things that you're passionate about, if you do triathlon, if you run, if you're involved in your community, these are things that mean something to us because we're all looking for people that like to do things other than what they have to do. But it might just happen that, like, if you've done an Ironman and I get your application, I'm going to be impressed. So I think you don't want to fail yourself by. That's not humble. Not putting these things on your application is not bragging. So that's something that we are really excited because it also shows, what you're interested in. How interesting are you? But again, if you donate blood, I mean, hopefully people do that. I mean, you will not believe the things that people will pull out from things they did when they were in middle school. But just, again, it gives us a better image of who you are as a person.
Right, but it's not a laundry list. It's, again, substantive.
No, and we want it to be genuine too. I mean, we do see those applications where you kind of look at, okay, I've done these activities, and you see, okay, this started probably about 3 or 4 months right before the application deadline, right? So we want these to be things that you are truly passionate about, that, have intrinsic value to you. There's a reason and a deeper purpose and passion behind those things, not necessarily because they're going to look great on a resume. And to the earlier question too, in terms of individuals from different backgrounds looking similar, part of what we want to understand and why we even ask for a resume is, yes, there's the what you did, but equally important is the how did you approach these elements and why did you do it as well. So just to put that I volunteered or that I put as a part of these organizations, we want to understand why was it so important to be involved in those, and how did you approach those? How do those kind of make up and fit within the unique story that you're trying to craft?
Right. So there's a voice, there's an authentic voice, there's even the grandparent checking that voice or the close friend for tone. There's another voice that comes into all of this, Morgan, and that's the voice of the recommender, but they're just so enthusiastic, have these great things to say. Does it have value to you, a recommendation?
Recommenders, of course. I think that oftentimes we find that actually the recommenders do a better job of bragging about the candidate than the candidates do themselves, which in some cases is good, right? I mean, I think there was a fine balance between showcasing your strengths and your achievements and being overly confident. But that's a great place where your recommender can come into play. I think that oftentimes a really strong recommendation can be a tiebreaker for candidates who may otherwise look equal, or that can be just enough to push the admissions committee to say, you know what, let's interview them. Let's give them the opportunity to tell this story in person. And I think we also recognize that increasingly business schools are diminishing the available word count for candidates to share their own stories, meaning we are cutting back on the number of essays that we're requiring you to submit. And so, we're all sitting here telling you about all these amazing things you have to tell us and your accomplishments and achievements, but also tell us about your challenges. But really, most schools have 1, 2, or maybe 3 essays to do that in, and that's not a lot of word count space. So oftentimes that additional detail comes through from the recommenders. And so I think it's really critical to make sure that you're preparing your recommenders appropriately, right? That you are fully sitting down with them, reminding them why you're going to business school, right? You probably have very top of mind all of those amazing achievements and accomplishments and impact that you've had on the organization, but that may not be top of mind for them, particularly if they aren't your current direct supervisor. So preparing them and providing them with that information is going to do the candidates, a good service when it comes time to the application itself and the review.
Right. Michael, in this city alone, there must be thousands of influential Columbia alum that could be writing those letters of recommendation. But in terms of who we then approach, it's not because they went to the school I'm applying to. You want that substantive relation. It's got to have a gritty, a real genuine depth and insight in that application.
Yes. Sometimes we do see recs that are unhelpful because they come from someone very powerful, very influential, but essentially the person gives you a sentence or two that says, nice personality, or I've known him since he was 2 because I have a long-term relationship with the family. That's never helpful. So someone who knows you and can speak to your strengths and your areas of growth as well is much more helpful than the power and influence of that person.
Right, and professionally, a reflection perhaps of the last 2-3 years rather than going back 5 or 6 years at the early stages of your career.
Exactly. But having said that, though, sometimes there are exceptions where that a person has a long-term relationship, or you worked with them 5 years ago, but that person gave us some real insight as to what drives that person. So sometimes it can be helpful. So there's no one answer. It depends.
Now, I'm very proud of us as a panel because we've almost done, and there's something we haven't talked about. We haven't, that word, that 4-letter word. People might be getting smarter, maybe, but Gmat scores are certainly creeping higher and higher and higher. My real question is, where does this stop? How does this help? Can each of you perhaps put the Gmat in context as part of this holistic admissions approach? Colin, 731, that's perhaps the highest Gmat average Booth has had.
Right, it is, and I think, so to take a step back, I mean, the Gmat is really helpful for comparing across a very complex applicant pool, right? People from different regions, different backgrounds. But what is the purpose for it? The purpose of it is really for us to get a sense for your readiness to pursue a graduate management education, specifically business school. So that it serves an actual purpose there, but beyond that, it's one aspect that fortunately or unfortunately gets a lot of awareness, a lot of visibility. But there is a wide range, and it's only, again, one data point. So there's other areas. If you have a high GMAT, to Michael's point, that's great, but that in and of itself is not going to get you an interview or get you admitted. It really is, and you guys probably hear this term, over and over again, but it really is a holistic process. Yes, it's an important indicator in terms of your readiness, but there's so many other pieces to that can round out. And likewise, if your GMAT score is on the lower range of some of the schools that you're looking at, that's not necessarily going to completely bounce you out. There's so many other areas where you can offset that, where you can identify different strengths as well.
Right. And with people hanging on your every word, you did say that the range this year was 790, so scoring 800 on the GMAT is actually a bad idea, right?
We'll see. We'll see. Every year is different. Every round is different, and I think that's what really keeps this interesting. The freshness to every single year, the freshness to every single applicant pool. So despite a lot of the challenges, good, bad, and otherwise that we've talked about for this year, I think we're all definitely looking forward to a great class of 2021 applicant pool.
Right. GMAT themselves, Morgan, are talking about, well, in fact, if we contextualize GMAT scores and even look at them regionally, in certain parts of the world, a 660 or 670 puts you in the top 5 or 10% of those test takers. I mean, will you take that into account or other factors?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, whether we're talking about the GMAT or extracurricular involvement, for example, I think that understanding your achievements, given the opportunities that were presented to you or the overall context of your experience is something that's critically important, right? Whether that's regionally or by industry, you may be somebody who, for example, didn't have a lot of time to study for the GMAT because you're also supporting family members, or because, for example, you might be military and you're deployed, or whatever the situation might be. We want to take all of those factors into consideration when we are evaluating you. And I think, probably the number one hang-up for candidates not applying to a top program is the GMAT, and looking at the average or the ranges and saying, oh, I'm below that average, or I'm not in that range, I'm not going to apply. And I think the number one thing I would say is, don't pull yourself out of the equation that early on, right? I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard is that, you have a 0% chance of getting in if you don't apply. So the first step, regardless of what your GMAT score is, or the years of work experience, or the titles you've achieved, the only opportunity you have to get in starts with hitting submit. And so I think it's really important for folks to keep that in mind.
Right. I didn't realize that Wayne Gretzky was providing advice for business school applicants. Michael.
Two quick things. We have a 530 in our classes here who I think is amazing and will do fantastic things going forward. And going back to the point about regional differences, I do a lot of recruiting and outreach in Africa. And there are countries where you literally have 150 to 180 million people living in that country, but there's like 2 test centers. There are pretty much nothing in terms of reputable like test prep services or consultants and so on. So going back to that 660, it means a lot, or a 700 from that country is just like amazing. So I think it's important for the people in our space to really have a real sense of what's happening in countries, because in the end, it's not a contest about like who will get the best test scores, but who will actually have more impact on countries, economies, institutions, and be leaders of enterprise. And most of the data that I've seen says the best leaders are not necessarily the people that have the highest test scores.
Yeah, there's actually great research that the highest post-MBA salaries are almost always those with the lowest GMAT scores is one interesting measure. You're going to be overwhelmed with questions later on, hopefully not about the GMAT, but about the programs and individuals. So perhaps just to leave this audience with one sort of parting piece of advice, either, Heather, from the perspective of, we've talked a lot about what you'd like to see, but even from the perspective of what you don't want to see, from allegiance to a particular football team or any other, some of the pitfalls or the classic mistakes that people really could have avoided.
You starting with me?
Yes.
I think when you go through this process and you haven't really researched, not visiting. So I guess my advice is to visit. So I think a pitfall is when students look strictly at rankings. We know that that's a place to start, but this is going to be a very meaningful experience. The MBA should not be, as I mentioned before, transactional. So not getting to know the community, not knowing the nuances of that program and the people that will ultimately be godparents, bridesmaids, whatever, these are the people that are going to be with you for the rest of your life. And so you're going to get a quality education at many of all the schools that are in the room starting at 3, but what's really the good fit? So not putting the time and the resources. You're already going to spend a ton of money on business school. Put the money and resources into visiting as best you can.
Right. Thank you for starters. Colin, either what to do or something to avoid.
Well, I mean, I think that's really good advice. I think, intimately understanding, the culture, the environment that, really builds the foundation of the schools that you're looking at is going to be vitally important. Beyond that, I don't know if it's as much mistakes as it really is. I think there's areas where there's missed opportunities, where applicants are leaving something on the table. You think about it, it's one thing to kind of craft a very unique, very genuine story that hits on all of the accomplishments and really feels genuinely you. It's a completely different way to really leverage all the different elements within the application to do that successfully. So we see a lot of great applications, great stories, great fit, but there's areas where you really could have been much more holistic in terms of really making a compelling argument and utilizing the application to do that.
Right, and Morgan, with your advice, if you can also bring in perhaps interviews that we've touched upon, students, or when you're on the road doing those interviews, any advice that you'd have for that situation as well?
Sure. So the first thing I just want to say is that it's all going to be worth it. I promise it will probably be the best 2 years of your life. So keep on trucking, you'll get there. And if my advice around interviews would be to, one, make sure you treat it just like you would a business interview, an interview for a job. I think sometimes, particularly when the interviews are being conducted by students or alumni, there might be a tendency to feel that you can be a little bit more casual with that person, and I think you should come in treating it just as formally as you would an interview for a job. Dress the part, come prepared with questions. If you have to get somewhere, on campus or elsewhere, make sure you allow time for parking, for traffic, show up on time. The basics, bring those into the interview for business school as well. And I think ultimately it's also really important, again, particularly if it is with students or alumni, to know that the bias that they bring to the table, right? And just recognize it. They love their program. That's why they chose it. That's why they're volunteering to be an interviewer. So make sure that you show a love for that same program, that you show a knowledge for it when you are connecting with them in that interview.
Right, so the formal dress code, with one exception, if you're applying to Columbia and Booth, you can have a lot of fun with the socks that you choose to wear. I mean, look at these 2 pairs of socks. They're just extravagant. Michael, last word with you, and either advice or a pitfall to avoid.
Get good socks. But more important, there's a line I heard years ago, which I stole and love. No dream schools, just dreams, right? So if you live this life filled with purpose, right? Like, what would you do if you wanted to accomplish this big, hairy, audacious goal, but you couldn't go to B school? What would you do, right? How would you act? What job choices would you take? And the thing is, like, when you do that, right, and you start to be very intentional about the actions that you take, independent of getting into a top school, you literally become more attractive to that school. Because when I see you in the admissions committee, like, the thing that I'm seeing is they're doing all these amazing things. Imagine what will happen if you put them or connect them to a 46,000 person alumni network, great professors, great faculty. That person who's doing amazing things gets better, gets sharper. So again, no dream schools, just dreams. Live this purpose-filled life where you're accomplishing your goals even independent of schools. You become more attractive to schools when you do that.
Right. As Michael moves us towards dreams, I introduced this panel talking about a dream team panel. If you look at the amount of experience and perhaps even more importantly, the quality of the insights that they've just shared. So if you're following the live stream, do share this video with friends, with colleagues that might appreciate it. For everyone, of course, that is here, you have the opportunity to meet with our panelists later on this afternoon. Alumni love their schools, but I think our panelists do too. It's a beautiful afternoon in New York, and here they are giving up their time to meet with you. So Michael, Morgan, Colin, Heather, thank you very, very much for this panel, and enjoy meeting with all of these candidates later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.